If you grew up in the early 2000s, there's a face you remember instantly, even if you haven't thought about it in years. A young comedian with sharp timing, effortless confidence, and a smile that made it look like success came easy. His name was Lil JJ, and for a brief moment, he was everywhere. Television stages, comedy specials, award show crowds laughing on cue. Then, without warning, he was gone. Over the years, the internet tried to fill the gap. Some said he was blacklisted. Others whispered jail, drugs, or a mental breakdown. A few insisted he'd been chewed up and spit out by the industry like so many before him. The stories grew darker the longer he stayed away. Because in Hollywood, disappearing without self-destruction doesn't make sense to people. If you leave, they assume you were forced. But what if every rumor you heard was wrong? What if Lil JJ didn't disappear because he lost everything, but because he saw something most people don't see until it's too late? Lil JJ walked away at the exact moment the world expected him to want more. More fame. More money. More exposure. More noise. Instead, he chose less attention, less pressure, less control from an industry that had already started deciding who he was allowed to be. And that choice cost him his visibility, but may have saved everything else. By the end of this video, you won't just understand where Lil JJ went. You'll understand why so many people never could, and why his disappearance says far more about fame than it does about him. Stay with me, because the most shocking part isn't that he vanished. It's that he survived. Before the lights, before the microphones, before audiences ever learned to laugh on cue, Lil JJ was just a kid who happened to be funny without trying to be. Not practice in the mirror funny. Not chasing laughs funny. His humor came naturally. Quick observations, playful exaggerations, and a timing that felt instinctive rather than learned. People around him didn't describe him as someone who wanted attention. They described him as someone who created moments wherever he went. That distinction matters. Many performers chase laughter because they crave validation. Lil JJ, by most accounts, made people laugh because it was how he processed the world. Comedy wasn't a costume he put on, it was a reflex. Even before stages entered the picture, humor was simply how he communicated, how he connected, how he survived awkwardness and tension. That kind of comedian is rare, and it's often misunderstood by the industry later on. As a teenager, his life didn't resemble the polished origin stories often sold to audiences. There were no years of grinding in comedy clubs or carefully engineered branding strategies. What he had instead was raw presence. When he spoke, people listened. When he joked, people leaned in. He didn't look like someone rehearsing a future in entertainment. He looked like someone being himself in public. That authenticity would become both his greatest strength and his quietest burden. Because when success arrives before identity fully forms, it doesn't ask whether you're ready. It simply decides you are. And Lil JJ was about to learn how unforgiving that can be. When Lil JJ broke into the mainstream, it didn't feel gradual. It felt explosive. One moment he was an unknown young comic, and the next he was being introduced to audiences as the future of comedy. Television doesn't often take its time with young talent. It accelerates them, packages them, and moves on to the next thing if momentum slows. The applause was real. The opportunities were real. And so was the shock. What viewers saw was confidence. What they didn't see was adjustment. Suddenly, there were expectations about how he spoke, how he dressed, what kind of jokes he should tell, and most importantly, who he was allowed to be. When success comes early, there's little room for experimentation. You're not encouraged to evolve. You're encouraged to repeat what worked. Laughs became metrics. Appearances became obligations. Every performance carried the weight of not disappointing the image people had already built around him. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Early fame often skips the part where young performers learn how to say no. Lil JJ was young enough to still be discovering himself, yet old enough to be treated like a finished product. The industry saw a marketable personality. Audiences saw a rising star. But behind the scenes he was learning, very quickly, that success didn't come with instructions, and it certainly didn't come with protection. The speed alone was disorienting. Fame arrived before wisdom. Recognition arrived before stability. And while the world applauded his ascent, very few stopped to ask how someone so young was meant to carry it. At first, being branded as a young comedy sensation felt flattering. Titles usually do. But labels have a hidden cost. Once assigned, they rarely evolve. What began as praise quietly hardened into expectation. Audiences wanted a specific version of Lil JJ, one that stayed frozen in time. Clean humor. Familiar rhythm. Predictable energy. Growth wasn't part of the deal. As he matured, The space to change narrowed. The industry prefers consistency over authenticity, especially when an image is already profitable. Deviating from what people expect doesn't just confuse audiences, it unsettles executives. And unsettling executives is how opportunities quietly disappear. This is where many young performers fracture. Some rebel publicly, some spiral privately, and some, rarely, step back and reassess everything. Lil JJ didn't implode.
He didn't lash out. He didn't make noise.
Instead, something far more dangerous to fame happened.
He began to pull away.
Not dramatically.
Not all at once. Just enough to breathe. Just enough to think.
Just enough to recognize that the version of himself being celebrated wasn't fully aligned with the person he was becoming. And that realization is terrifying when your livelihood depends on staying exactly the same. By the end of this phase, the warning signs were already there. Missed appearances, fewer public moments, longer gaps between visibility. To the outside world, it looked like momentum slowing. To him, it felt like survival. And the real disappearance hadn't even begun yet. By the time Lil JJ's name carried weight, the rules had already been written for him. He just hadn't been shown the fine print. Success in entertainment is often described as freedom, but for young performers, it's closer to a contract with invisible ink. You get access, exposure, and money, but in exchange, you surrender control slowly, almost politely. Meetings replaced moments of quiet. Decisions were no longer just personal, they were strategic. What joke lands best with this demographic? What appearance keeps the brand safe? What version of you sells without risking discomfort? None of these questions were asked out loud, but all of them shaped the path ahead. And for Lil JJ, the pressure wasn't about failing, it was about never changing. The comedy that once felt natural began to feel monitored. Not censored in the obvious way, but guided. Redirected. Polished until it fit neatly into expectations. The industry didn't want him to grow older in public. It wanted him to stay familiar.
Predictable. Profitable.
That kind of pressure doesn't crush everyone immediately. It wears you down quietly. It turns creativity into obligation. It turns joy into performance. And eventually, it turns applause into noise. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. But inside, the cost was accumulating, and no one was counting it but him. There's a moment many former stars talk about later in life, the first time they said no and felt the room change. For Lil JJ, that moment didn't come with a dramatic confrontation. It came with subtle shifts. Less enthusiasm from gatekeepers.
Fewer follow-ups.
Delayed callbacks that never arrived. Hollywood doesn't punish you loudly. It simply stops calling.
He wasn't difficult.
He wasn't demanding. He just wasn't endlessly available. And in an industry that thrives on compliance, boundaries are often mistaken for attitude. Saying no to one opportunity can quietly close 5 others you never even knew existed. This is where myths are born. When visibility drops, people assume something must be wrong. They imagine conflict, controversy, or collapse, because the truth that someone simply chose not to participate anymore feels unbelievable. Fame is supposed to be addictive. Walking away is supposed to be impossible. But Lil JJ wasn't chasing addiction. He was chasing alignment. And alignment in that world comes at a cost few are willing to pay. As his public appearances became rarer, the questions started multiplying. Fans noticed. Comment sections filled with confusion. Blogs speculated. Message boards connected dots that didn't exist. In the absence of information, imagination took over. Silence became evidence. People asked where he went, but they weren't really asking, they were guessing. And the guesses leaned dark, because dark stories travel faster.
Jail. Drugs. Mental collapse.
Industry punishment. Each theory gained traction simply because there was no official explanation to challenge it. What no one considered was that silence might be intentional. In a culture that rewards constant visibility, choosing quiet looks suspicious. But sometimes silence isn't a symptom, it's a boundary. Sometimes disappearing from the spotlight isn't about losing relevance, it's about reclaiming peace. Lil JJ never corrected the rumors. He never stepped forward to reassure strangers that he was fine. And that decision confused people even more. Because we expect public figures to defend their narratives. He chose not to. And that choice would define how his story was told, by everyone except him. Most exits from fame are loud. They come with scandals, breakdowns, or headlines designed to explain the fall. Lil JJ's exit was different. It didn't arrive with chaos, it arrived with distance. No dramatic farewell. No public resentment. Just fewer appearances, fewer interviews, and eventually, none at all. This wasn't a collapse.
It was a retreat.
And retreats don't fit the Hollywood narrative. There's no villain, no lesson audiences are comfortable with. Because if someone can simply walk away, then fame isn't as powerful as we think. And if fame isn't all powerful, then maybe the dream itself needs to be questioned. Lil JJ didn't leave because he failed to survive the industry. He left because he succeeded long enough to see it clearly. And once you see it clearly, going back becomes the hardest thing of all.
Rumor 1, he was blacklisted.
When a celebrity disappears quietly, the word blacklist is almost inevitable. It sounds dramatic, believable, and comfortably sinister. Fans imagine secret meetings, angry executives, doors slammed shut behind the scenes. In Lil JJ's case, this rumor spread faster than any confirmed fact, because it explained the silence without challenging the fantasy of fame. But here's the truth that rarely gets said out loud. Real blacklists are rare, and when they do exist, they're usually loud. Careers don't vanish without collateral damage.
Lawsuits surface. Public feuds spill out. Whistleblowers talk.
None of that happened here. What actually happened was far less cinematic, and far more uncomfortable for people to accept. Lil JJ didn't get pushed out.
He stopped pushing in.
In Hollywood, momentum is currency. If you're not actively chasing the next role, the next booking, the next headline, the machine assumes you've opted out. And once you opt out, even quietly, the machine doesn't chase you back. Not out of cruelty, but indifference. There's always someone else willing to say yes. From the outside, that indifference looks like punishment. On the inside, it often feels like relief. Lil JJ wasn't erased. He simply didn't fight to stay visible. And in an industry where visibility equals existence, stepping back is misread as being shut out. The myth of the blacklist stuck because it made the audience feel better. It suggested he was robbed of something, rather than willingly releasing it. Because if he chose to leave, then fame isn't the prize we've been taught it is. Rumor 2, he ended up in jail. Few rumors are more damaging, or more easily disproven, than this one. And yet it lingered for years, recycled across forums and comment sections with zero evidence. Mugshots that didn't exist. Court cases that never happened. Stories that sounded true simply because people repeated them often enough. There were no arrests.
No convictions.
No criminal records hiding in plain sight. So why did this rumor stick? Because when a public figure disappears, people assume consequence. We're conditioned to believe that leaving the spotlight requires a dramatic explanation, especially for young black entertainers, who are too often burdened with stereotypes before facts ever enter the conversation. Jail became a convenient narrative because it was familiar. It fit a pattern audiences had seen before, even if it didn't fit reality. And once a lie becomes familiar, it starts to feel true. Lil JJ never publicly addressed it. Not because he couldn't, but because he didn't see the value in correcting strangers who weren't actually seeking truth. Engaging with false narratives often gives them oxygen. Ignoring them lets them burn out on their own. The problem is, lies don't always burn out. Sometimes they linger, waiting for someone new to discover them and pass them along again. And for years, that's exactly what happened.
Rumor 3, he had a breakdown.
This rumor felt softer to people.
More sympathetic. Less accusatory.
And because of that, it spread just as widely, if not more. The idea that Lil JJ couldn't handle fame sounded reasonable to those who had watched other young stars unravel publicly. But there's a difference between breaking down and slowing down. There was no public meltdown.
No erratic behavior.
No crisis played out for clicks. What there was, instead, was exhaustion. The kind that doesn't scream, it whispers. The kind that doesn't explode, it withdraws. Burnout doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like clarity. Lil JJ recognized something many people don't recognize until much later, that being constantly visible was costing him more than it was giving back. That the version of himself the world wanted required ongoing sacrifice. And that continuing down that path meant trading long-term peace for short-term applause. Choosing rest in a culture addicted to productivity looks like failure. Choosing privacy in a culture obsessed with exposure looks like weakness.
But it wasn't a breakdown.
It was a boundary. And boundaries, especially when set without explanation, make people uncomfortable.
So they label them, diagnose them,
turn them into rumors they can understand. What Lil JJ did wasn't collapse under pressure. He stepped away before the pressure could collapse him. There is always a moment, sometimes loud, sometimes barely noticeable, when a person realizes they can no longer live on autopilot. For Lil JJ, that moment didn't arrive with panic or headlines. It arrived with clarity. He had done what he was told success looked like. He had stood on the stages people dream about. He had been recognized, applauded, validated by strangers. And yet, the deeper he went into that world, the clearer it became that continuing meant giving up something he wasn't willing to lose: control over who he was becoming. This wasn't a dramatic exit fueled by anger. It was a quiet assessment. A realization that staying visible required constant compromise, and that compromise over time reshapes you. Not violently. Gradually. Until one day, you don't recognize yourself anymore. Lil JJ chose to step away before that happened. That choice wasn't celebrated. It wasn't rewarded. In fact, it went mostly unnoticed at first. Because in an industry built on spectacle, calm decisions don't register as news. But make no mistake, this was the most defining move of his life. He didn't wait until he was burned out beyond repair. He didn't wait until resentment took root. He left while he still liked who he was. And that may be the rarest kind of exit there is. When the cameras stopped following him, life didn't end, it slowed. And in that slowing, something unexpected happened. Space appeared. Space to think without performance. Space to exist without judgment. Space to live without the constant question of how it would look to an audience. Contrary to popular belief, stepping away from fame doesn't mean disappearing from purpose. Lil JJ didn't retreat into isolation or chaos. He built a life that didn't depend on applause. A life where privacy wasn't a luxury, it was the foundation. He explored interests without needing them to be marketable. He reconnected with normal rhythms, days without schedules dictated by appearances, nights without expectations to be on. The kind of life most people live, but few famous people ever get to fully experience once they've tasted recognition. And here's the part that surprises people the most: he didn't miss it the way everyone assumed he would. Because once you've lived under constant evaluation, anonymity can feel like freedom. There were no headlines to manage, no image to protect, no pressure to maintain relevance.
Just choice.
And choice, when it's finally yours again, is powerful. This wasn't hiding. It was rebuilding, on his own terms. Every few years, nostalgia brings the same question back to the surface: why didn't Lil JJ come back? In an era where reboots, reunions and viral rediscoveries are currency, his absence feels almost rebellious.
The truth is, he could have returned.
The offers didn't disappear entirely. Comedy thrives on familiarity, and his name still carried recognition. But coming back would have meant re-entering the same system he had consciously stepped away from, one that rewards visibility over well-being and expects you to fit the version people remember. A comeback would have required explanation,
Justification. Performance.
It would have turned his personal decision into a public narrative once again. And that was exactly what he had left behind. Lil JJ didn't want to be a memory repackaged for profit. He didn't want to relive a chapter of his life simply because others felt nostalgic for it. He had already written a different ending for himself, one that didn't need applause to feel complete. In a world that constantly asks, "What happened to you?" His answer was simple, even if he never said it out loud. Nothing went wrong. And sometimes, that's the most unsettling truth of all. Hollywood loves arrivals. It tolerates downfalls. But it has no language for voluntary exits. When someone leaves quietly, without scandal, without spectacle, the industry doesn't know how to process it. There's nothing to market, nothing to warn against, nothing to sensationalize. So it does the only thing it knows how to do. It forgets. For Lil JJ, walking away didn't trigger outrage or backlash, it triggered erasure.
Not maliciously. Mechanically.
The entertainment machine moves forward, not backward. And anyone who steps off the conveyor belt simply disappears from view. This is the unspoken rule: you are welcome as long as you are visible. Once you stop showing up, the system stops acknowledging you ever stood there. There are no exit interviews for peace. No headlines for choosing normalcy. The industry rewards endurance, not boundaries. It celebrates those who survive the grind, not those who refuse it. And because Lil JJ didn't pay for his exit with humiliation or tragedy, there was no lesson for Hollywood to extract from his story. So his name slowly faded from conversations, not because he failed, but because he didn't conform to the narrative of struggle the industry understands. In entertainment culture, silence is rarely interpreted as strength. It's read as weakness, guilt, or defeat. If you don't explain yourself, people assume you can't. If you don't defend your absence, they assume you're hiding something. But silence can also be a refusal. Lil JJ never gave the industry closure. He didn't sit down for a "where are they now" interview. He didn't craft a redemption arc. He didn't let the public dissect his reasons. And because of that, the silence itself became the story. What many don't realize is that speaking out often invites more control, not less. Once you explain yourself, others get to interpret, edit, and monetize your explanation. Silence denies them that power. And that's why silence is uncomfortable to watch. It forces people to confront a truth they'd rather ignore. Not every life decision needs public approval. Not every chapter requires an audience. Not every success story ends on a stage. By staying quiet, Lil JJ kept ownership of his story, even as others tried to tell it for him. Lil JJ's story feels unique until you step back and widen the lens. Then a pattern emerges, one that's easy to miss because it doesn't trend. Young talent rises quickly. The system extracts what it can. And when the person either burns out or steps away, the narrative shifts from celebration to speculation. Most people only notice the collapses,
The scandals. The public breakdowns.
but there's another category that rarely gets discussed: those who leave intact. They don't make headlines because they don't explode. They don't become cautionary tales because nothing went wrong. And that's precisely why their stories matter. Lil JJ didn't disappear because he couldn't handle fame. He disappeared because he understood it. He recognized that staying would require constant negotiation with his identity, his boundaries, and his future. And rather than wait until those negotiations turned hostile, he ended them himself. That decision places him in a quiet, almost invisible group of people who chose long-term well-being over short-term applause. People whose success can't be measured in clicks, but in peace. And that may be the most radical choice anyone in that industry can make. Here is the truth that makes people uncomfortable, because it challenges everything we're taught to believe about success. Lil JJ didn't lose his career. He completed a chapter. Audiences prefer stories with villains, collapses, and cautionary endings. They want to believe that if someone disappears, it must be because they couldn't handle the pressure, made the wrong choices, or paid a hidden price. That belief protects the fantasy that fame is always worth it, and anyone who leaves must have failed. But Lil JJ's story refuses to cooperate with that fantasy. There was no scandal to point to.
No addiction to blame.
No breakdown to dissect. And because there was no disaster, people filled the gap with suspicion. The idea that someone could simply decide they were done, while still capable, still respected, still wanted, felt almost offensive. Because if walking away is possible, then staying is a choice. And that realization forces an uncomfortable question. How many people remain in lives they've outgrown, simply because leaving feels harder than staying? Lil JJ became a mirror people didn't want to look into. Years after his disappearance, the culture finally began catching up to what he had quietly understood. Burnout became a word people used openly. Mental health stopped being whispered about. The cost of constant visibility started entering public conversations. Suddenly, his decision didn't look strange.
It looked prophetic.
In a world where people are expected to document every thought, monetize every moment, and perform happiness endlessly, choosing privacy has become a radical act. Walking away from attention, real attention, not imagined relevance, now looks like something many people crave but few can achieve. Lil JJ didn't need a viral moment to justify his exit. He didn't wait for permission. He stepped away before exhaustion turned into damage, before resentment hardened into bitterness. What once looked like disappearance now looks like foresight. And the irony is impossible to ignore. He left early, but he left whole. Without interviews, without statements, without explanations, Lil JJ still delivered a message, just not the kind that fits into headlines. His silence taught that success doesn't always demand permanence. That identity doesn't need to be frozen for public comfort. That peace doesn't have to be justified to strangers. He reminded us that fame is loud, but fulfillment is quiet. That applause fades faster than clarity. That being remembered isn't always worth being consumed. Most importantly, his story exposes a truth we rarely admit. Some people don't fail out of the spotlight, they graduate from it. And graduation doesn't come with trophies.
It comes with space.
With anonymity. With a life that finally belongs to you again. So now, when people ask, "Remember Lil JJ?
What happened to him?"
The answer isn't tragic. It isn't scandalous. And it isn't shocking in the way rumors promised. It's shocking in a deeper way.
He chose himself.
In an industry that demands everything and offers very little protection, he stepped off the stage before the lights could blind him. He walked away before the applause turned into obligation.
He disappeared from view, but not from life.
And maybe that's the ending people struggle with the most. Because if disappearing was actually surviving, then maybe staying visible isn't the victory we think it is. If this video made you see fame differently, if it changed how you think about success, pressure, or walking away, then like this video to support honest storytelling. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dive videos on forgotten stars, untold Hollywood stories, and the truths behind sudden disappearances.